The wind clawed at the panes as if eager to intrude upon the solemnity of the house. It was near midnight when Inspector Gerald Hale first stepped through the oak doors of Greystone Manor, summoned by a telegram terse enough to curdle the blood. Murder at midnight. Come at once. The long hall glimmered with the reflection of storm-lashed lamps, and in their faltering light, Hale's boots rang against the marble floor, a sound unnervingly loud in the hush that gripped the place. Lady Agatha Vere met him halfway, her silhouette lean and angular against the grand staircase, her voice pitched low as though the house itself might overhear. "Inspector, thank heaven you've come. It's Charles. She broke off, her composure fraying at the edges, though not enough for theatrics. Hale had known her in passing, formidable, wealthy, with the cool assurance of those bred never to doubt their authority. Tonight that assurance lay cracked like a porcelain mask. He followed her through corridors hung with ancestral sternness to the library, where the crime revealed itself with theatrical perversity. Charles Vere sat or rather slumped in the high-backed chair by the hearth, his head lolled at an unnatural angle. The flames had guttered low, and in their sullen glow, the skin at his throat gleamed oddly bloodless, save for one neat incision that traced from just beneath the jawline to the hollow of the neck. A single wound, no sign of struggle. On the desk before him lay a letter. Hale's eyes fastened upon it, instantly not sealed, but folded once with a precision that spoke of deliberate care. Across its surface sprawled a sentence in ink so black it might have been freshly bled. Midnight remembers what men forget. No signature, no date. Beneath the letter, the detective noticed something stranger still, a scattering of what looked like salt, coarse grains glinting like frost. Against the dark wood, Hale bent closer, noting the stark absence of weapon. No knife, no blade, not even the telltale mark of one hastily hidden. The windows were latched from within, the curtains drawn, the French doors bolted with iron slides, and the only key to the library hung now from the inside lock, mocking the notion of an intruder, a classic locked-room puzzle, but with details to point it to dismiss as mere coincidence. Who found him? Hale's voice broke the taut stillness. I did. Lady Agatha's hands gripped each other like talons. I came down from my usual tizen. He'd been reading here since supper. He said he had letters to write. When I entered, her eyes darted toward the dead man, then away. That note, it wasn't there earlier. No one else in the house. Hale pressed. My niece Margaret, her fiancé Captain Lorimer, and the staff, of course. But Charles sent most to bed early. He disliked disturbance when working. Hale absorbed this with the slow patience of a man aligning chess pieces. A locked room, a single cryptic message, salt grains strewn as though in ritual, and the wound clean, almost surgical, spoke less of rage than of method. Whoever killed Charles Vere had done so with chilling economy. He moved methodically, cataloging impressions. The grate held no poker, save the heavy brass one in its stand, spotless and cold. Books loomed like sentinels on either side of the desk, spines unbroken, but for one shelf slightly askew, as though a volume had been recently withdrawn and perhaps replaced in haste. He drew a gloved finger along the rim of the desk blotter. Immaculate, the letter, that was another matter. Hale unfolded it fully, holding it to the lamplight. Beneath the main phrase, in smaller script, almost invisible, an initial D. His gaze swept the floor. No footprints marred the carpet's deep pile, save those leading from door to hearth. Yet near the skirting board, faint but undeniable, clung a thread of crimson silk, too fine for a servant's livery, too vivid for masculine attire. A woman's then, but Lady Agatha's gown was black bombazine, severe and unbecoming. Margaret Vere, yes. The niece. Hale recalled her name from the brief gossip columns, often linked to bold colors and bolder talk. He straightened. No, one is to leave, he told the butler, who had appeared ghost-like at the threshold. Draw the bolts. This house holds its answers. As the night wore on, the storm deepened, hemming them into their circle of lamplight and suspicion. Hale questioned each in turn. Lady Agatha, pale and brittle as spun glass. Margaret, whose defiance trembled on the cusp of fear. Captain Lorimer, square-jawed and steady, yet too eager in protest. From each he gleaned fragments, nothing whole, nothing clean. Yet through it all ran a single discordant note. Charles Vere had been uneasy these past weeks. They said, haunted by letters that came without postmark, slipped beneath doors or laid upon pillows, each bearing some gnomic phrase in that same bold hand. Midnight remembers what men forget: salt on the desk, a thread of silk, a locked door, and a dead man who, by every account, feared no living soul until these whispers began. Hale stood once more before the hearth, watching the flames claw upward as if striving to seize some truth from the choking dark. Behind him, the house murmured a sigh of wind, a creak of boards as though alive with secrets, and then came the soft rustle of paper from Charles Vere's coat pocket. Drawn by the weight of chance or fate, Hale discovered another letter, sealed this time, and addressed not to the master of Greystone, but to D. He slid it open with careful fingers. The message was brief, almost tender in its venom. When the clock strikes 12, your silence will pay for every word you spoke. The inspector's jaw tightened. Midnight had struck and silence indeed reigned. But who among them bore that initial, and why, in a house so fastened against intrusion, did death creep in like a guest unseen? Hale closed the letter and let his gaze drift toward the French doors, their bolts glinting mutely in the lamplight, too secure unless the killer never needed to leave. Outside, the wind screamed against the glass, and the manor crouched like a beast in the dark, holding tight to its murderous secret. Hale stood before the fire a long moment after the letters. Words had faded into memory, his thoughts moving with the cold, inexorable rhythm of a pendulum. He did not trust haste. Haste fogged the mind. Yet even as the constables moved about photographing, measuring, marking angles with dull efficiency, he felt the weight of time pressing like a hand at his throat. Murder, once done, begins to seep outward in whispers. Before dawn, those whispers would harden into lies. He crouched by the desk again, letting his gaze drift not on the obvious, the letter, the salt, the lifeless man, but on the edges of the picture, where truth liked to crouch unseen. The grains of salt, curious, not spilled, but placed, for they formed a crescent faint, but discernible where they clung in a subtle arc along the blotter's rim. Ritual? Or theater meant to mimic ritual? He scraped one crystal into a handkerchief and tucked it away without comment. The killer had wanted someone to notice, but not to understand. That was always their mistake. They underestimated the eye that notices everything. Footsteps broke his reverie. Constable Ferris, pink-faced and earnest, shuffled in with his notebook clutched like a Bible. "Sir, we've taken statements from Lady Agatha, the niece, and Captain Lorimer. They all say the same. No one left their rooms after 10. Hale rose, dusting his hands. "Then one of them lies, and I mean to know which." His tone carried no heat, only iron. "Where are they?" "In the drawing room, sir, nervous as cats." He followed Ferris down the dim corridor where portraits loomed with accusatory stares, each frame catching lamplight like a watchful eye. The drawing room glowed warm against the storm's snarl beyond the windows, yet the warmth felt brittle, like lacquer overwrought. Lady Agatha presided from a wing chair, her profile severe in the lamplight. Margaret sat near the hearth, her crimson wrap pooling about her like a drop of blood spilled upon snow. Lorimer prowled behind her chair, restless, his jaw set tight. "Inspector," Agatha greeted, her voice a thread drawn taut. "Must we remain huddled here? This ordeal is intolerable." "You'll endure it," Hale replied, his gaze moving not on her words, but on the flicker too swift for most eyes. When Margaret's fingers tightened on the armrest at his entrance, and Lorimer's hand brushed her shoulder with what seemed reassurance or warning, hard to tell in the dance of shadows, he took a seat with deliberate ease, as though to chat away the evening. "Tell me," he said mildly, "was Mr. Vere in good spirits tonight?" A pause barely perceptible, then Lady Agatha answered. "He was preoccupied. Letters," he said. "His affairs required order. And what of you, Miss Vere?" Hale turned his glance upon Margaret, watching the flicker in her eyes. She met his gaze with a defiance polished bright by fear. "Uncle was always brooding over something. Tonight was no different." Hale smiled faintly, curious. For a man who brooded, he left no ink on his cuffs, no smudge on his fingers. "I should have expected it if he wrote much." He let the words fall like crumbs, then looked away, as if the observation meant nothing. In the silence that followed, he caught it, the smallest hitch of breath from Margaret, the quick dart of her gaze toward Lorimer. Ah, thought Hale, a chord touched there. Before he could pluck it further, Ferris entered with the household ledger at Hale's request. The detective flipped it open idly, skimming names, duties, all ordinary, save for a notation in the butler's tidy script. Cook dismissed this evening. Illness. Departed before supper. Hale closed the book softly. So one door had opened tonight after all. Strange, he murmured, half to himself. Illness seldom strikes with such convenience. Lady Agatha stiffened. What are you implying? Nothing yet, Hale said, rising. But illness leaves traces on linens, on cups, wheel. See, his tone was bland. Yet his mind raced ahead. A dismissed servant could carry a letter as easily as a tray, or a blade. Back to the library he went, retracing steps, eyes raking over what others had seen and dismissed. There by the hearth a faint smear upon the andiron, not blood, wax, crimson-hued, as though from a candle seal, yet no such candle burned in the room. He pried it off with his penknife, holding the fragment to the light. Old habit told him, keep the oddments. They speak when all else is silent. Something else nagged. The chair Charles Vere's final throne was drawn slightly askew from the desk, as if turned by an angle deliberate, almost ritualistic, and on the carpet near. Its leg, a depression faint but present heel-shaped, smaller than Vere's own. A woman's shoe. Likely. He photographed it, then covered it with a square of glass to preserve. At 2:30, Hale sought the pantry, where a sleepy scullery maid blinked under the sudden glare of lantern light. Show me the cook's things, he said, his voice soft but edged. A battered valise lay ready, as though packed in haste. Among the aprons and caps, he found what he expected, a scrap of paper torn from a larger sheet, its ink blotched yet legible. Midnight remembers, the same hand, the same ink. His pulse quickened, though his face betrayed nothing. Returning, he passed the drawing room once more. Through the half-open door, he glimpsed Margaret and Lorimer in murmured conference, their figures drawn close like conspirators in a tapestry. But it was not the nearness that held him, it was the glint of crimson silk at her shoulder, identical to the thread he had plucked from death's chamber. He let the door swing wider, his tread noiseless on the thick carpet. You keep late. Hours for those professing innocence, he said softly. Margaret started. Lorimer wheeled, his jaw clenching like a trap. Discussing the weather, were you? Hale's smile was thin as wire. Before they could muster denial, the wind rose in a sudden wail, rattling the windows like a warning. The clock on the mantel struck 3, each note tolling through the silence like a verdict deferred. Hale looked from one to the other, his mind knitting patterns too tangled yet to name, but the first threads were there, glimmering in the dark. And then came the butler, pale as the storm outside, bearing an object upon a silver salver with the tremulous dignity of a man delivering doom. Inspector, this was found in the scullery drain. Upon the salver lay a knife, slender, cruel, its blade washed almost clean save for the rust-brown ghost of what had been life. Hale regarded it without surprise. So the cook's illness had teeth, he said softly, yet even as he took up the weapon, something in his marrow whispered caution. The knife was too obvious, too timely. A bone tossed to lead the hound astray. The truth lay deeper, coiled like a serpent in shadow, and he had only begun to stir its sleep. The storm outside had begun to wane, the wind now only a whisper through the eaves. Inside, the manor still hummed with that unsettling tension, the kind of silence that precedes confessions, or worse, deception. Inspector Hale stood in the dim hallway, his fingers rubbing the hilt of the knife, lost in the small but deliberate markings etched along the steel. They were faint but distinctive, like a fingerprint left on a page, speaking of hands that had not simply wielded, but cared for the weapon. He took one last look at the drawing-room door, where the hushed voices of Margaret and Lorimer continued their fevered exchange. There was something too polished about the captain's stoic face, and Margaret, her face had been too expressive, her eyes darting like a hunted animal. Hale knew the signs, the way people lied when they were sure the truth would never find them. Tonight, however, the truth was already at his doorstep. He returned to the library, where the body remained still, as cold as the house that enveloped it. Lady Agatha's tension had not diminished. She stood by the windows now, her back rigid, as though the storm outside held some dark promise for her. The butler, too, was silent, his gaze lowered, as though awaiting orders from an unseen authority. Hale approached Lady Agatha first, his voice low and even. "We need to revisit the facts. Everything you told me earlier must be true, but I have a few more questions." He watched her shoulders tense, but her back remained straight, her poise intact. "I've told you everything I know, Inspector. I've said nothing but the truth," she replied. Her tone clipped, but with an undercurrent of something faintly defensive. He studied her for a moment before continuing. "You mentioned that Charles had been preoccupied with letters recently. Letters that disturbed him. How long had this been going on?" She glanced towards the door, as if the question itself might be too probing. "Weeks, maybe longer. He received strange letters, but he wouldn't discuss them with anyone." Hale leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "Did he ever say who they were from, or what was in them?" Lady Agatha hesitated just for a beat too long. "No, Inspector, he didn't, and frankly, I never asked." She met his gaze now, direct and unflinching, but Hale could see the faintest tremor in her lower lip, a subtle flicker of something, perhaps fear, but it vanished as quickly as it came, masked by the marble calm she wore so well. "Perhaps I should speak to the servants about this," Hale said, taking a step back, allowing her space. "Sometimes they see more than we realize." Her expression stiffened. "I don't think that's necessary. The staff is loyal, and I'm certain they wouldn't know anything of value." Hale's eyes narrowed slightly. "Loyalty is a tricky thing. Sometimes it's the loyal ones who know more than they care to say." Lady Agatha's lips pressed together in a tight line, but she said nothing further. The silence between them filled with an unspoken challenge. Hale nodded, moving on without a word. His next stop was Margaret. She sat by the fire now, her crimson wrap still draped over her shoulders, the flames casting an eerie glow on her delicate features. As Hale approached, she looked up at him, her expression unreadable. There was something about her, perhaps the way her eyes flickered to the door when she noticed his gaze, that suggested she was holding back more than she was letting on. "You've been very quiet, Miss Vere," Hale began, settling into the chair opposite her. "I hope you're not too uncomfortable with all of this. You must be quite shaken by your uncle's death." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, as though sizing him up. "I'm fine, Inspector. I've had my share of family tragedies. One learns to deal with it." "Indeed," Hale said, leaning forward slightly. "Tell me, Margaret, what can you recall from the evening? What did you and your uncle talk about before he died?" She stiffened, her fingers curling slightly on the armrest. "Not much. He was distant, as usual. There was nothing unusual about the evening, aside from his mood, which was typical." Distant. Hale's brow furrowed. "What do you mean by distant?" She hesitated for just a moment too long. He wasn't himself. He was agitated. "But that's nothing new. Uncle Charles had many things on his mind. It's no secret." "Things like what?" Hale pressed, watching her closely. Margaret's gaze flickered away. "Things he wouldn't discuss with me. He was preoccupied." She looked back at him, the mask of composure slipping just enough to reveal the barest hint of anxiety. "He always had secrets." Hale nodded slowly, taking in her words. Preoccupied. It was a word that had surfaced before, but it was starting to take on a weight now. A weight that made him wonder just how much Margaret knew and how much she was hiding. Before he could ask another question, a low voice interrupted him. "Inspector, if you please." Captain Lorimer had approached from the doorway, his face calm, but his eyes sharp with suspicion. "You've spoken with Miss Vere. Perhaps now you might spare a word for me." Hale regarded him steadily. The captain was as composed as ever, his posture perfect, his voice smooth. There was something almost too controlled about him. "Of course, Captain," Hale replied, nodding toward an empty chair. "Please have a seat." Lorimer lowered himself into the chair across from Hale, his hands clasped in his lap. "I understand this situation is rather delicate," he began, his voice steady but with an undertone of irritation that Hale didn't miss. "But I assure you, I have nothing to hide. Charles and I were We were friends, if not close ones. But I cannot see how my involvement could have any bearing on this unfortunate tragedy." Hale studied him for a long moment, the silence between them thick with unspoken things. "I'm not suggesting you have any involvement, Captain. But you were in the house tonight. You were near the scene." Lorimer's jaw tightened, but his eyes never wavered. "I was in the drawing room with Miss Vere, as I've already told you. We were speaking quietly, that's all night." Hale asked, leaning forward slightly. There was an edge in his voice now, something pointed that he hadn't allowed himself before. Lorimer's eyes flickered barely, but it was there and for a fraction of a second. Hale thought he saw something behind the calm Fouad, but it was gone almost immediately. "Yes, Inspector. All night. I've already explained." Hale didn't press further, not yet. The cracks were there, small and fleeting, but visible to someone who knew where to look. And there was one thing that had become clearer than ever, each of them. Lady Agatha, Margaret, Lorimer was hiding something. They each had their story, but the versions didn't add up. The contradictions were becoming more pronounced, but the final puzzle piece had yet to reveal itself. Hale's instincts told him there was something deeper, something that tied them all together, something that had been lurking beneath the surface long before the storm had even begun. As he stood to leave, he turned one last time to look at Margaret, whose gaze followed him. She smiled faintly, but it was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Good night, Inspector," she said softly, as though daring him to question her again. And in that moment, Hale knew he would question them all, piece by piece, until every word, every motive, every lie unraveled in the cold light of truth. The morning sun barely crested the horizon when Hale re-entered Greystone Manor. The air was thick with the scent of rain and earth, the aftermath of a storm that had washed away the night's tension, but not the sense of unease that still clung to the house. Inside, the manor was still, too still as though holding its breath, waiting for something to give. But Hale, for all his patience, knew that the answers would not come easily. In fact, they never did. They were buried deep beneath layers of fear, pride, and the tangled web of human nature. He stood in the grand hall for a moment, taking in the silence, the walls lined with family portraits staring down upon him. He wondered, for the 1000th time since arriving, which one of these faces was lying to him. Which of these people had the blood of Charles Vere on their hands? The mystery had grown more complex, not less, with every passing hour. Lady Agatha's aloof demeanor remained unchanged since the night before. She was as calm as she could be under the circumstances, but Hale had noticed the way her eyes kept flicking to the door whenever someone new entered the room. It was subtle, but it was there. She wanted to control the narrative, keep everything contained. But there were cracks in her facade, and they were growing wider. Margaret, on the other hand, was a study in contradiction. Her outward composure was laced with the faintest tremor of something else, something raw, something that made her too eager to be cleared of suspicion. She had smiled at Hale the night before, but the smile hadn't reached her eyes, and the way her fingers had gripped the armrest when he first spoke to her, it was a clear sign of nerves, of something hidden just beneath the surface. And Captain Lorimer, Hale was still trying to make sense of the man. There was something too polished about him, something that felt rehearsed, as though he had a script he was determined to follow. Hale had seen enough lies in his career to recognize the signs, and Lorimer's discomfort had been just as evident as Margaret's. But Lorimer was not just uncomfortable, he was guarding something important. That much was clear. He had spent the night poring over the evidence again, focusing on the small inconsistencies in the stories and the emotions that didn't quite match the words. What did they all stand to gain from Charles's death? Lady Agatha had her wealth, Margaret had her inheritance, and Lorimer, well, he had a connection to the family. But none of it added up, not yet. Each one had a reason to kill, but none of them seemed strong enough to explain the clean, deliberate nature of the crime. In the library, Hale sat before the desk, running his fingers over the surface where Charles Vere had once worked. The salt grains had been removed, but the letter remained, its cryptic message still etched in his mind. Midnight remembers what men forget. What did it mean? Was it a warning or a confession? There were too many questions and only one way to begin untangling the web. He would need to confront each suspect again, piece together their stories, and listen carefully for the threads that didn't match. He began with Lady Agatha. She had just finished a breakfast of tea and toast when Hale found her in the drawing room, seated primly in her usual chair, her hands folded in her lap. She looked at him expectantly, as though the events of the previous night had already become a distant memory for her. But Hale knew better. "Lady Agatha," he began, "I've been thinking about your statement from last night. You said Charles had been preoccupied with letters for weeks. Did he ever mention the content of these letters to you?" Her eyes flickered, just for a moment. "No, he was a private man. He didn't discuss his affairs with anyone." Her voice was calm, but Hale caught the tightness in her words, affairs. The choice of the word was telling there was a weight to it, a suggestion of something more than just business. "You're sure about that?" Hale pressed, watching her closely. "Because it seems odd that someone would be so secretive about their correspondence, especially when it's affecting their behavior." Lady Agatha's lips pressed into a thin line. "I know my brother-in-law. He wasn't one to share his worries. If you're implying something, Inspector, I assure you that you're mistaken. I had no reason to believe he was in any kind of danger." Hale nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing slightly. He wasn't convinced, but for the moment, he moved on. "I spoke with the staff last night," he said. "The butler mentioned that Cook had been dismissed early, and the scullery maid found a rather odd item in the drain, something that doesn't quite add up. Do you have any idea why Cook might have left in such a hurry?" Lady Agatha's eyes narrowed at the mention of the dismissed servant. "I don't know. Cook has been with us for years, and I trust her. If she left early, it was because she was ill. Perhaps you should speak with her directly." "Perhaps," Hale said, his voice neutral, "but the timing of her departure seems rather convenient." There was a long silence as Lady Agatha stared out the window, her expression unreadable. "I don't know what you want from me, Inspector. I've told you everything I know. I am not a criminal." Hale leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving her. "I'm not accusing you, Lady Agatha, but I am trying to understand what happened here, and so far, your story doesn't add up." She stood abruptly, her face flushed. "I've had enough of this," she said, her voice sharp. "I've told you what I know. You'll find no more answers from me." "Perhaps not," Hale replied softly, "but I'll find them somewhere." He left her standing by the window, her back straight, her composure shattered for just a moment. Hale's gaze lingered on her. Then he turned and made his way down the hall to where Margaret waited. She was sitting in the same chair as before, her fingers twitching nervously at the edge of her wrap. Her face was pale, but when she saw Hale enter, she straightened, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Inspector," she said, her voice tight, "what can I do for you? Tell me again about the night your uncle died." Hale began, sitting across from her. "You said you were in the drawing room with Captain Lorimer. How long were you there before you heard anything unusual?" Margaret's eyes flickered to the side, her lips parting as if to speak, but then hesitating. "I don't remember exactly. It was quiet. We were talking, but nothing important. The storm was getting worse, and I remember thinking I should go to bed." But she faltered, her eyes meeting his with something unspoken in them. "But I stayed." "And why was that?" Hale asked, his voice a little sharper than before. "Why did you stay when it was clear something was wrong?" Margaret shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know. Maybe I was afraid. I didn't want to be alone." Hale considered her words carefully, weighing them. Fear. It was a powerful motivator, but it didn't explain everything. "Did Captain Lorimer stay with you the whole time?" She nodded quickly. "Yes, he was with me. We spoke. And then I heard the sound of footsteps, and I went to check on my uncle." She hesitated again. "And that's when I found him." Hale leaned in, his eyes locking with hers. "And you didn't think to mention the footsteps last night?" Margaret's face flushed, her breath quickening. "I didn't think it mattered. I didn't want to make things worse." Hale's eyes softened, but only for a moment. There was something in her story that still didn't sit right, but he could feel it, the shift in the air, the subtle weight of guilt that hung between them. Margaret was hiding something, but what? Finally, Hale rose, his mind swirling with the pieces of the puzzle that still didn't fit. jealousy, fear, greed. All of it swirled together, creating a maze of motives that led nowhere, at least, nowhere clear. But one thing was certain: he was getting closer. By the time the sun had climbed higher, casting pale light across the manor, Hale felt the weight of the investigation settle more heavily on his shoulders. There had been no more confessions, no sudden bursts of clarity. The walls of gray stone seemed to close in tighter with each passing hour, each conversation that danced in circles, but left the same questions unanswered. But that morning, as the clock struck 11, something changed. The butler, pale and shaking, had appeared in the drawing room, a small, bloodied object clasped in his trembling hand. He had approached Hale with an expression so worn with dread it could have been carved in stone. "Inspector, sir, this was found in the back garden." He handed over a tarnished silver locket, its edges scratched and worn. Hale had taken it without hesitation, turning it over in his palm. There was no mistaking it. The engraving was unmistakable. "To my darling, always." The inscription was brief, but it was enough to tell Hale what he needed to know. This was the personal possession of Lady Agatha. He had seen it before around her neck, as she'd moved through the halls, a delicate chain tucked beneath her gown. The locket, now stained with the dampness of the soil it had been buried in, had clearly been torn from her. No mistake about that. A breakthrough, in any other circumstance, would have been hailed as the turning point. But Hale felt no such elation. Instead, his gut churned with an unease he couldn't shake. He had no illusions about human nature. The way Lady Agatha had reacted the night before, the way her words had been to neat, to perfect it, told him everything. But there was something far deeper buried in her actions than simple guilt, and that something nagged at him with increasing urgency. He had no choice but to confront her now. Without the veil of politeness, Lady Agatha stood by the window when Hale entered, as she always did, her back straight, her gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the curtains. When she heard him approach, she turned slowly, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Inspector," she said, her voice cool but edged with something else, something that still held the power of command. "What is it this time?" Hale didn't waste time with pleasantries. He held the locket out between them, his fingers steady. "This was found in the back garden, Lady Agatha. Tell me how it ended up there." She glanced at the locket, her face pale for the briefest of moments before she regained her composure. The mask of the proper widow slid into place, but Hale could see the cracks forming beneath it. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied smoothly, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. "You've been wearing this for years, Lady Agatha. I saw it on you last night. How did it end up in the dirt, half buried?" She hesitated, her lips parting as though to speak, but finding no words. The silence stretched longer than either of them would have liked. Finally, she exhaled, a bitter, humorless laugh escaping her lips. "You think it's that simple, that I just lose it, Inspector?" She stepped forward, her posture rigid, almost accusatory. "If you think that's what happened, you're mistaken. I'm asking you to explain it," Hale said, his tone flat, pressing her with the calm persistence that had cracked more than one alibi. "You don't wear it by accident. So how did it end up outside? Was it removed from you?" Her eyes darted toward the door, almost as though she expected someone to appear at that very moment. Then, with a strained breath, she met his gaze again. "You think I'm involved in my husband's death?" Her voice was a quiet storm, dangerous in its calmness. "You think I killed him?" She said the words slowly, as if tasting their bitterness, as if daring him to accuse her outright. Hale didn't flinch. "I think you've been hiding something from me. And this locket," he said, his voice growing quieter, more focused, "is the key." The tension between them thickened. For a moment, it seemed like Lady Agatha would break her mask, slipping, revealing something raw beneath. But instead, she swallowed hard and straightened her back once more, summoning her usual grace. "I had nothing to do with it," she said, her voice still strong, but laden with something Hale couldn't quite decipher. "I didn't kill him, if that's what you're implying." She turned away from him abruptly, her hands trembling for a brief moment before she clasped them together in a practiced manner. "But I do know someone who might have." Hale's pulse quickened, and he leaned in closer, Who? Lady Agatha's lips tightened. Margaret. The name hung in the air. But it didn't shock him. It made more sense than it should have, considering what he'd already observed. He had always suspected there was more to the niece than met the eye. But to accuse her so directly, it shifted the focus of the case entirely. Hale could feel the pieces shifting beneath him. The web was becoming tighter, more intricate. Explain, Hale said, keeping his voice low and even. What makes you think Margaret is involved? Lady Agatha let out a soft, bitter laugh. She's always been too ambitious, too calculating. You wouldn't know it from looking at her. But she's been trying to get her hands on the estate for years. You saw how she was last night, nervous, fidgeting. She's scared that everything she's worked for might slip through her fingers. And the locket? Hale asked, his voice growing more insistent. She's always been envious, Lady Agatha continued, her eyes darkening. She wanted everything. She wanted my position, my life, my wealth, and she never hid it. She's been trying to make Charles's life miserable for years, impatient to be the lady of the house. She couldn't wait for the inheritance. So, yes, I think she killed him. Hale listened intently, his mind racing with the possibilities. He wanted to believe her, to take her words at face value. But there was something off about this entire scenario. She was too confident, too eager to shift the blame. He stood up, the locket still in his hand. I'll have to speak with Margaret again. And Captain Lorimer, too. I'm sure he knows more than he's let on. Lady Agatha nodded without a word, her gaze never leaving his. She didn't need to say anything more. Her silence was almost as revealing as her words. But as Hale turned to leave, something in the back of his mind tugged at him. He didn't believe it. Not yet. There were too many pieces left unaccounted. For too many contradictions in Lady Agatha's story. She wanted him to believe it was Margaret. But Hale knew better than to accept the obvious answer. The case had taken a turn, yes, but the real criminal was still in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. And until he found that moment, until he found that missing piece of the puzzle, the game would continue. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to creep into the very bones of Greystone Manor. Hale stood by the windowsill, watching as the dying light painted the world outside in muted hues. His mind, however, was far from the peaceful scene before him. Every conversation, every subtle shift in the air had begun to pile up in his mind, each one leading him back to the same conclusion. Something wasn't right. The pieces were too neatly placed, too carefully aligned. Lady Agatha's accusations about Margaret had felt too convenient, too neatly packaged. Hale wasn't a man who believed in simplicity, not when it came to murder, and something, deep down, told him that the locket so pointedly planted in the garden was a piece of theater, a performance designed to shift the focus, to nudge him toward the obvious suspect. But it was the shadows in the corners of those stories, the little things that had been left unsaid, that kept him awake. He turned from the window, his gaze settling on the stack of old papers that lay on the desk. Some of them were fresh, some dated back years, but there was one in particular that had caught his attention earlier that afternoon. A newspaper clipping, yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. It was about a fire that had ravaged a small house on the outskirts of town, one that had belonged to a man named Richard Mallory. Hale had glanced over it briefly, dismissing it as irrelevant, but something about the name had gnawed at him. Mallory. It had been a name in the background, mentioned only briefly in passing by Captain Lorimer, a man of questionable reputation, a man who had been involved with the Vere family, specifically with Lady Agatha many years ago. Hale had thought it nothing more than a distant memory, a man long gone. But now, with everything he had learned in the last few days, the name had begun to haunt him. Hale pulled the clipping closer, scanning the details. It wasn't much, just a brief mention of a fire that had destroyed Mallory's home and claimed his life. But there was one line that caught Hale's eye. The fire's origin remains undetermined, though many suspect foul play was involved. It is believed that Mallory's connections to the Vere family may have played a role. Foul play. Connections to the Veres. Hale felt the pieces shift again. The fire had happened almost a decade ago, long before the death of Charles Vere, but the timing was significant. What had been Mallory's connection to the family? more importantly, what had Lady Agatha's involvement been? Hale's instincts told him that there was something important buried in the past, a connection that had never been fully explored, never been fully understood. He stood up, the papers slipping from his fingers as he went to the door. Margaret had spoken about her uncle's secrets, and Lady Agatha had alluded to something more than simple jealousy. It wasn't just about money or inheritance. It was about something deeper, something darker. He made his way down the hall to the drawing room, his steps steady, each one carrying him closer to the answers he needed. Inside, Margaret sat in the same chair, her eyes focused on the fire, her expression distant. Lorimer was there as well, his sharp eyes following Hale as he entered. But it was Margaret who caught his attention first, her hands twisting the edge of her wrap in nervous tension. "I need to speak with you both," Hale said, his voice quiet but firm. He wasn't here for pleasantries anymore. He had enough of those. Now, it was time to get to the heart of the matter. Margaret looked up, startled. "What is it, Inspector?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I've been going through some old records," Hale began, his gaze fixed on her, watching her every reaction. "You mentioned your uncle's secrets and how he kept things from you. Well, I've uncovered something that might shed light on those secrets." Lorimer raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Margaret's hands stilled, her face draining of color. She didn't speak either, but the tension in the room became palpable, thick as fog. There was a fire. A man named Richard Mallory died in it, along with his house. The fire's origin was never determined, but there were rumors about Mallory's connections to your family, Margaret. The name struck like a whip. Margaret flinched visibly, her eyes widening. That's not possible." Hale ignored her denial, his voice cutting through the room. "It is possible, Miss Vere. And what's more, it seems Mallory wasn't just a passing acquaintance. He had ties to Lady Agatha, to your family. And now, I'm beginning to think that the fire, Mallory's death, might not have been an accident. After all." Margaret's face twisted in horror, but she said nothing. Lorimer, however, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm on the armrest. Hale turned his attention to him, narrowing his eyes. "Captain Lorimer," Hale said, his voice sharp, "what do you know about Richard Mallory?" The captain's expression hardened instantly, but Hale caught the brief flicker of something guilt, perhaps, or recognition. "I'm not sure what you mean, Inspector. Mallory was just a man. He wasn't important to us. He was nothing more than a shadow in the past." Hale stepped closer, his presence filling the room like a gathering storm. "A shadow, you say? Perhaps, but shadows have a way of creeping into the present, and your reaction tells me there's more to this story than you're letting on." Lorimer stood, the sudden movement betraying a flicker of panic in his eyes. "I've told you everything I know. Now, if you'll excuse me, I don't think I can be of any further help." He moved toward the door, his back straight, but Hale caught the hesitation in his step. "You know more than you're admitting," Hale said, his tone cold. "Both of you do." Margaret's lips trembled, but she still refused to speak. Hale's eyes flicked to the side, his mind racing through the connections, through the pieces he was now beginning to understand. Mallory's death, Lady Agatha's ties to him, and the quiet desperation in Margaret's voice when she'd spoken of her uncle. It all pointed to one thing. The Vere family had buried more than one skeleton over the years. The tragedy was not just the murder of Charles Vere, it was the culmination of a pattern that had been set in motion long before Hale had ever arrived. There were deep roots here, roots that went back far beyond Charles's death. The lies, the manipulation, the betrayal, it was all part of something far darker than Hale had originally imagined. Before he could speak again, Margaret stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice breaking as her hands clasped together in front of her. "None of this was supposed to happen. We never meant for him to die." Her eyes darted to Lorimer, as though seeking comfort, but he stepped back, his face unreadable. Hale's heart skipped a beat. He knew the truth now. The fire, the secrets, the connections, it was all part of the same twisted tapestry. The Vere family was not as innocent as they had led him to believe. Their past had come back to haunt them, and now, with every piece that fell into place, Hale knew that the game had changed. "Tell me everything," Hale said quietly, his voice a command that left no room for resistance. "Now," Chat said. The air in the drawing room was thick with tension. Margaret's hands shook, her fingers digging into the fabric of her dress as she struggled to keep her composure. Lorimer stood near the door, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed firmly on the floor. It was almost as though the walls themselves were closing in on them. Hale could feel it. To the weight of the truth, heavy in the room, but not yet fully revealed. The revelations had come in fragments, a puzzle whose pieces had all but fallen into place. The fire, the ties between Richard Mallory and the Vere family, the subtle fear in Margaret's eyes, it all pointed toward something deeper. Hale knew that, but it wasn't enough. He needed one more push, one final test to break through the walls that had been so carefully erected around them. He stood in front of Margaret, his gaze steady, unyielding. "You've been holding something back, Miss Vere," he said, his voice low but firm. "I can feel it. You think you're protecting someone, but you're only making things worse for yourself. The truth will come out one way or another." Margaret's lips parted, but she said nothing. Her eyes darted toward Lorimer for a brief moment, then back to Hale, her breath quickening. She was on the edge, and Hale knew it. She was close to cracking, but not yet there. Hale's eyes shifted to Lorimer, his stance rigid. The captain hadn't said much, but Hale had observed him closely enough to know that he was hiding something. He wasn't as detached as he appeared, not as free from guilt as his polished exterior suggested. Hale took a step forward, his voice dropping even lower. "You think I'm wrong, don't you? You think you've covered all your tracks, but the more I dig, the more your stories unravel. All I need is one crack in the facade, one lie to expose everything, and I will find it, no matter how long it takes." Lorimer's eyes flicked to Margaret, then quickly back to Hale, his lips pressed together, the slightest quiver running through his jaw. But it wasn't enough. Hale needed more. He had to change tactics. Hale's gaze softened, just slightly, and he turned toward the fireplace, where the embers of the fire were slowly dying. He seemed to contemplate the flames for a long moment, as though lost in thought. His voice, when it came, was quieter, almost conversational. "You know, I've been thinking about your uncle, the things you said about him, about his secrets. But what if I told you that Charles Vere wasn't just a man caught in a web of his own making? What if I told you that he was a man who knew more than anyone realized? A man who was about to expose something dangerous?" The shift in the room was palpable. Margaret's shoulders stiffened, and Lorimer's fingers twitched. Neither of them spoke, but both of them reacted to the suggestion, their composure cracking for the briefest of moments. Hale turned back to them, his gaze hardening again. "You see, I've been thinking about that night, the night your uncle died. You both were in the drawing room. You heard the footsteps, Margaret, and you thought it was nothing. But it wasn't just the footsteps that are important. It was what came after, the silence. There was something in the way the house fell quiet afterward that doesn't add up." Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it again, but Lorimer shifted uncomfortably, his hand resting briefly on the door frame. Hale didn't miss the subtle twitch of his fingers, the unease that flashed across his face. "Captain," Hale said, his voice now sharp, "I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. You knew Charles well, didn't you? I don't think. You were just a casual acquaintance. You had a closer connection than you've admitted. And when you heard those footsteps, you knew it wasn't an accident. You knew what was about to happen." Lorimer's expression flickered, and for just a moment, Hale thought he saw something: guilt, perhaps fear. Whatever it was, it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by the same stoic mask he'd worn since the beginning. But Hale wasn't finished. "You see," he continued, "I've learned a few things. Charles wasn't just a man on the brink of ruin. He was a man on the brink of uncovering something that could bring everything crashing down. His secrets weren't just personal, they were dangerous, and that's why he had to be silenced." Margaret's breath quickened. "You don't know what you're talking about," she whispered, her voice trembling, but Hale could see the way her eyes darted toward Lorimer again, the way she seemed to be waiting for him to speak up. Hale's lips curled into a faint smile, but it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I think I do. I think I know exactly what was happening that night, And I think you're both trying to cover up something that can no longer stay hidden." For a moment, the room fell into a heavy silence. Hale could feel the weight of their lives pressing in on him, but he also felt something else shift, a crack in the foundation. Margaret's gaze had wavered, and Lorimer's fingers were twitching again, tapping a subtle rhythm against the doorframe. It was a small detail, almost unnoticeable, but it told Hale everything he needed to know. There it was, the crack. The moment he had been waiting for. "You're nervous, Captain," Hale said, his voice almost a whisper now. "You don't like the way this is going. You don't like that I'm getting too close. You're afraid of what will happen if I push you any further. And Margaret, well, you've been running from the truth for too long, haven't you?" Lorimer's posture stiffened, but he said nothing. Margaret's face was pale, her hands clenched at her sides. The tension in the room was unbearable. Hale took a step closer, his voice cold and calm. "Here's the thing. I'm not going to wait for you to come clean. You're going to tell me everything, all of it, because I already know more than you think. The only question left is whether you'll tell me before I drag it out of you." Margaret's lips parted, but it was Lorimer who spoke first. "You don't know what you're doing," he said, his voice low and tight. "You have no idea what you're about to unleash." Hale didn't flinch. "I think I do. And it's about time you understood that I'm not going anywhere until I get the truth." The room seemed to hold its breath as Hale watched the two suspects, one trying to hide behind silence, the other already on the verge of breaking. The walls they had built were crumbling, piece by piece. Hale had struck at the heart of their fear, and now it was only a matter of time before the final confession would come spilling out. And when it did, the true horror of what had been buried beneath the surface would be revealed in full. The tension in the room was thick, and Hale could feel the weight of it pressing against him, threatening to crush him under its force. He had cornered them, both Margaret and Lorimer, and they knew it. Every word he spoke, every movement he made, brought him closer to the truth. The pressure was mounting, and Hale could see the cracks in their composure deepening. But just as the case seemed on the verge of breaking wide open, the world tilted on its axis in a way Hale hadn't anticipated. That had happened in an instant. Hale had excused himself briefly to review the papers in the study, allowing Margaret and Lorimer the chance to regroup. He needed to give them just enough space to reveal something, anything. He was already piecing together the final strands, tying them back to the fire, to the locket, to the decades of hidden animosities buried deep within the Vere family. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked on in the quiet of the study, an almost rhythmic reminder that time was running out. Hale stood by the desk, flipping through the last of the documents he had gathered, the faded news clippings and the police reports from years ago. His mind raced, pulling connections together like a spider weaving the final strands of a web. The identity of the killer, whoever it was so close. He could almost taste it. Then there was a noise, a sudden, sharp click followed by the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. Hale's heart skipped a beat as he rushed out of the study, every instinct telling him something had gone terribly wrong. He hurried down the hallway toward the drawing room, where the noise had originated, his mind already racing through possibilities. As he reached the door, he found it ajar. Inside, the scene was chaotic. Margaret was standing by the bookshelf, her face pale, her hands shaking as she stared at the floor. Lorimer, too, was there, his back to Hale, but his stance was tense, almost defensive. In front of them, the large window that overlooked the garden had been shattered. The remains of a glass paperweight lay scattered on the floor, its jagged edges glinting in the dim light. But it wasn't the broken window or the paperweight that caught Hale's attention. It was the desk. The small pile of papers, neatly arranged just moments ago, were now scattered across the surface in disarray. The most significant of them, the very documents that connected Lady Agatha, Margaret, and Lorimer to the fire, were gone. In their place was a single sheet of paper, hastily folded and shoved into the corner of the desk. Inspector Lorimer's voice was sharp, his eyes darting to Hale. I don't know what happened. There was a noise, a crash, and when I turned around, everything was gone." Margaret's voice trembled as she spoke. "I didn't do it. I didn't take anything. I swear I was just standing here. And then the window." Hale didn't listen to the explanations. His gaze fixed on the desk, scanning the mess in front of him. He could feel the walls closing in. Someone had just stolen the evidence that had been the cornerstone of his investigation. The final proof, the truth he had been working toward for days, was now gone. Hale's eyes narrowed as he stepped into the room, his every movement slow, deliberate. The broken glass crunched underfoot as he approached the desk. His mind raced through every possible explanation. And one thing became crystal clear. Someone inside the manor had deliberately destroyed the evidence. It wasn't just an accident. This was sabotage. He turned to face Margaret and Lorimer, both still standing by the broken window. "I suggest you both stop pretending this is some kind of coincidence," Hale said, his voice low and steady, but there was an edge of danger to it now. "I'm not blind. Someone here is trying to bury the truth, and I'm going to find out who." Lorimer stiffened, his jaw tight. "We're not responsible for this. Someone must have." "Don't." Hale cut him off sharply. "I'm not interested in excuses. Someone destroyed those documents, someone who didn't want me to find out what really happened. And I'm not leaving until I know who it was." Margaret's eyes flicked to Lorimer, her lips trembling as if she was searching for an answer she couldn't find. "We don't know who did it, Inspector. We didn't." "Enough," Hale interrupted. His patience was wearing thin. He glanced around the room, his mind working rapidly, calculating the angles, the motives. He had trusted them. He had believed in their stories, in the evidence they had given him. But now there was doubt, a creeping, insidious doubt that threatened to unravel everything he thought he knew. He turned back to the desk, his gaze fixing on the solitary sheet of paper that had been left behind. He approached it slowly, picking it up with careful hands. It was a hastily written note, written in a hurried scrawl, and as Hale unfolded it, the words jumped out at him. "I didn't want it to end this way. I never wanted anyone to die. But now, there's no turning back." His heart skipped as the full weight of the message hit him. Whoever had written this was desperately trying to cover their tracks, trying to make sure no one ever found out the full truth. Hale turned the note over, expecting more, but there was nothing. "Do you recognize this handwriting?" Hale asked, holding it up for Margaret and Lorimer to see. Both of them looked at the paper, and then immediately looked away. Neither of them answered. Hale's suspicion grew with each passing second. Someone had just tipped their hand. Whoever had taken the evidence was terrified. And terror meant there was something even bigger at play here, something even darker than Hale had imagined. The note, the shattered window, the missing papers, these weren't just acts of desperation. They were signs. Signs that the person responsible had more to lose than just a little bit of dirt being uncovered. "What does this mean?" Margaret finally whispered, her voice cracking. "What do you think?" "It means someone is willing to do anything to stop this from coming out. Anything at all," Hale said, his voice cold and calculated. His eyes flicked from Margaret to Lorimer, and then back to the window. "And whoever is behind this won't stop until they've buried everything, including themselves." The stakes had just been raised, and Hale could feel it in the pit of his stomach. The game had changed. And now, it wasn't just about finding the truth. It was about survival. Someone here had just declared war. The stillness in the room was suffocating. Hale stood there, his mind a whirl of possibilities, trying to make sense of the note in his hand, the shattered window, and the missing evidence. Someone was playing a game, and they were doing it with a level of skill and cruelty that Hale had yet to fully grasp. But before he could formulate a plan, a scream cut through the silence, sharp, high-pitched, and filled with panic. It was the kind of scream that pierced the air, making your blood run cold. Hale's heart raced, adrenaline surging through him as he bolted from the drawing room, the sound of his boots pounding on the marble floor echoing through the empty hallways. The scream had come from upstairs. Margaret, Lorimer. He reached the staircase and paused for only a moment before rushing up the stairs, his mind already jumping ahead to worst-case scenarios. Another murder, perhaps a sudden attack. What had they done now? He rounded the corner at the top of the stairs, only to find Margaret standing in the hallway, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. Her hands were shaking as she pointed toward the far end of the corridor. It's him," she gasped, her voice shaking. "It's Charles. He's back." Hale froze, "What do you mean? He's back." But before she could answer, a loud, deafening crash reverberated. Through the house, Hale turned on his heel, instinct kicking in as he sprinted down the hall toward the source of the noise. The door to one of the guest rooms had been flung open, the wooden frame splintered from the inside. He entered the room without hesitation, his heart pounding, expecting to find the worst. But what he saw made his blood run cold. Lying on the floor, face down in a pool of blood, was Captain Lorimer. Hale rushed forward, crouching beside him, his fingers brushing the captain's neck. There was a pulse, weak but present. Hale exhaled in relief, but only for a moment. The room was a mess, papers scattered, furniture overturned, and most chilling of all, a knife lying beside Lorimer's body, its handle smeared with blood. "Lorimer!" Hale hissed, shaking the captain's shoulders. He stirred slightly, groaning in pain, but didn't open his eyes. Hale pulled him into a sitting position, his grip firm. "What happened? Who did this to you?" Lorimer's eyes fluttered open, and for a brief moment, he seemed to focus on Hale. His lips moved, but the words came out in a strangled whisper. "It's not over. You're too late." Before Hale could press him for more information, Lorimer's eyes rolled back, and he passed out cold, his body slumping back into Hale's arms. Hale swore under his breath, his pulse racing. The house had just become a war zone. Someone was still pulling the strings, and they were far ahead of him. They had anticipated his every move, his every question, and now they were making sure he couldn't find the answers in time. He didn't have time to worry about the captain's condition. Hale quickly checked the room for signs of anything more, a struggle, a clue, anything that might reveal the identity of the attacker. There was nothing, no footprints, no signs of forced entry. The window was intact, and the door had been locked. The knife was the only clue, its presence a chilling message. This wasn't a random attack. It was calculated. Hale's mind raced. He could hear Margaret's sobs from the hallway, but there was no time to console her. The game had changed again. Someone had just tried to kill the one man who might have known more about the web of deceit than anyone else. He took one last look at the room before standing up. "Margaret," he called out, his voice steady but urgent. "Stay here. Lock the door behind you. Do not let anyone in until I return." She nodded numbly, too stunned to speak, as Hale dashed out of the room, his mind working furiously. He had no idea where the next blow would come from, but he knew it would come. The villain, whoever they were, was still out there, and they were no longer hiding in the shadows. They were making their move right under Hale's nose. Downstairs, Hale found the house in chaos. The servants had gathered near the front door, whispering frantically, but none of them could provide any useful information. The manor seemed colder now, darker. The walls that had once felt like safe confines now seemed like traps, closing in with every passing moment. Hale turned back toward the main hall, his mind already on the next steps. He needed to regroup, figure out who was still a threat, who could still be trusted. He needed answers, and fast. But as he made his way to the study, something caught his eye. A shadow, flitting past the window, too quick to be a servant, too deliberate to be a coincidence. His instinct screamed at him to follow, and without another thought, he bolted toward the back garden, the only place where the shadow had disappeared. Outside, the night air was bitterly cold, biting at Hale's skin as he sprinted across the lawn. The garden stretched out before him, dark and silent, the moonlight casting long shadows across the path. He could see no one, hear no movement, but he knew someone was out there. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he reached the corner of the garden. The shadow had led him here into a dead end. Then, without warning, the attack came. A sharp, sudden pain exploded in Hale's side, and he gasped, stumbling backward. His vision blurred for a moment, the world spinning, as his hand pressed to his side, feeling the warmth of blood soaking through his jacket. The figure who had attacked him stepped forward, a dark silhouette against the night sky, their face obscured by the shadows. "You're too late, Inspector," a cold voice rasped. Hale's head spun as he tried to focus on the figure before him. The voice was familiar, but it didn't make sense. He was too disoriented to process it. "You've been chasing ghosts," the figure continued. their voice laced with a cruel amusement. "And now, it's time for the final act." Hale's breath hitched, but his resolve didn't waver. Whoever they were confident. They thought they were in control. But Hale wasn't finished yet. The game wasn't over. It was just beginning. The cold bite of the night air hit Hale with a ferocity that sharpened his focus. The pain in his side burned, but it wasn't enough to distract him. He forced himself to steady his breathing, even as the shadowy figure before him seemed to revel in his weakness. His hand gripped his side tighter, trying to quell the blood that was slowly soaking through his shirt. But his mind was already working, already processing the fragments of this new puzzle. The figure stepped closer, the sound of their boots muffled by the damp earth, but Hale didn't move. His vision swam, the edges blurring, but he could still make out the outline of the person tall. A familiar shape. The voice, too, rang a bell. He was too disoriented to place it, but something about it tugged at the back of his mind. "You're too stubborn. Inspector, you should have stopped earlier. You've already uncovered more than you should have," the figure said, their voice dripping with satisfaction. Hale's brain was foggy, but one thing was clear. This wasn't a random attacker. This was someone who knew him, someone who had been watching, waiting for the perfect moment. But who? The figure stepped into the pale moonlight, and Hale's eyes snapped to them, blinking hard to clear his vision. Then it hit him. The angle of their body, the posture. They were too familiar, and yet so wrong. Hale had seen that movement before, just hours ago, when Lorimer had stood by the window. The same deliberate stance, the same calculated calm. The pain in Hale's side flared again, and he gritted his teeth, pushing through it. He had no time to waste. His hands were still trembling, but he forced them steady, keeping his eyes locked on the figure before him. "You," Hale gasped. "Lorimer." The figure's lips curled into a tight smile, but it was far from reassuring. "It took you long enough to catch on," Lorimer said, his voice now dripping with venom. "I was hoping you'd be a bit quicker, Inspector. After all, you've been so sharp with everything else, or so I thought." Hale's heart pounded. This was impossible. Lorimer had been the victim, lying in a pool of his own blood just hours ago. Hale had heard his weak, whispered words. He had seen him slip unconscious. But the captain before him now was no ghost. He was very real, very much alive, and far more dangerous than Hale had realized. Why? Hale's voice was ragged with disbelief. Why go to all this trouble? Why pretend to be dead? Lorimer's smile faded into something darker. "Why not?" he sneered. "The Vere family had everything to offer, but their secrets, they were my way in. I knew the game, Inspector. I knew what strings to pull. I thought you'd see it all. Eventually you did, didn't you? But too late. This game was never about justice. It was always about control." Hale's mind raced, the pieces starting to click into place. Lorimer had been in on it the entire time. He had played the part of the loyal captain, the steadfast ally, all while pulling the strings in the shadows, orchestrating the chaos to keep the truth buried. He was the puppet master, not the pawn. "You were never trying to solve the case," Hale said quietly, his voice steady now despite the pain. "You were trying to manipulate me, to keep me distracted, to keep the truth from being uncovered." Lorimer stepped closer, his cold eyes glinting. "In the dim light, you were useful, Inspector. You dug through the past. You questioned the right people. But in the end, you were just another piece in the game, a piece I needed to get rid of." He cocked his head, his eyes narrowing. "And you almost did it. You were close, too close. But the final piece, well, I couldn't let you have that." Hale's pulse quickened. The final piece. What had he missed? What detail had he overlooked in all of this? "Do you remember the locket, Hale?" Lorimer's voice was almost a whisper now, his tone thick with menace. "The one you found in the garden, the one that led you down the wrong path? You thought it was a symbol of guilt, didn't you? That it meant something. But that locket was never about guilt. It was about control, power, the key to understanding everything." Everything froze in Hale's mind as the revelation hit him like a punch to the stomach. The locket. Of course, it had always been right in front of him, just waiting to be uncovered. Hale had assumed it was connected to Lady Agatha, to the affair with Mallory, to some kind of deep betrayal. But Lorimer's words cut through the fog, sharp and clear. The locket had never been about anyone else. It had been about Lorimer, about him being able to control the narrative, to place himself in the middle of it all, to manipulate everyone around him, to distract them from the true goal, his goal. Lorimer had orchestrated the entire thing, from the fire to the murder to the stolen evidence. He had known that Hale would chase after the wrong leads, that Hale would focus on the connections to the Vere family, that Hale would be led into a web of lies built on decades of deceit. The pattern had been there all along, hidden in plain sight, and Hale had missed it. Lorimer, Hale's voice dropped to a low, dangerous tone. This isn't just about money, is it? It's about power, control. You've been playing everyone from the start. Lorimer's lips parted in a twisted grin. You finally understand, Inspector. But you're too late. He stepped back into the shadows, his hand brushing the hilt of a knife. The game is over for you now. The last word hung in the air like a death sentence, and Hale felt the weight of it settle in his chest. Lorimer had been one step ahead, always. Hale had been walking into his traps, his games, never seeing the full picture until it was too late. But Hale wasn't done yet. He couldn't be. There was still too much at stake. I'm not done, Hale said, his voice hard and unwavering, despite the pain coursing through his side. You may have played me, Lorimer, but I'm still standing, and I'm still coming for you. Lorimer's expression faltered for just a moment, barely a flicker, but Hale caught it. There was fear in those eyes, and fear meant weakness. It meant vulnerability. The real battle was just beginning. The moonlight cast long, stretching shadows across the garden as Hale stood, still reeling from Lorimer's revelation. The captain had been the puppet master all along, but the true depth of his deception was still unfolding. It wasn't just about power, control, or even money. It was something far more insidious. Hale pressed his hand against the wound in his side, the pain throbbing with every breath. But he barely noticed it now. His mind was racing. He had known something was off, but he hadn't anticipated this, the depth of the manipulation, the intricacy of the lies. Lorimer was no mere accomplice or hired hand. He had been the architect of this entire nightmare, weaving a web that ensnared everyone, including Hale himself. He couldn't allow himself to be distracted. Not now. He had to find the missing pieces, the ones that tied everything together. Lorimer's grin, as wicked as it had been, was still fresh in his mind. The way he had stood in the shadows, a puppet master who had long ago pulled the strings. But Hale now understood. The true motive wasn't just the pursuit of power or wealth. It was something darker, something that had been festering for years, hidden beneath the surface. Hale's mind flashed back to the old, forgotten case that had been buried in the archives, one he had only glanced at. During his early investigation, the Vere family had been in the public eye for generations, yes, but there had been something strange, an incident that hadn't quite made sense, a death that had been glossed over, tucked away like an old wound. He had brushed it aside, assuming it was irrelevant. But now, in the wake of everything that had happened, it was beginning to make sense that it wasn't just about the Vere family, the fire, or even the stolen evidence. Lorimer's true motive went much deeper than that, and Hale was starting to see it now. The rain had started to fall, light at first, then quickly turning heavier. Hale had no choice but to make his way back inside the manor, his mind still spinning as he recalled the conversations he had with the various suspects. Margaret's nervousness, Lorimer's calm demeanor, it was all starting to line up, piece by piece. They hadn't been pawns in Lorimer's game. They had been tools, manipulated just as Hale had been. He headed toward the study, where he had last seen the files, the ones that contained the family's secrets, the ones that could finally expose Lorimer for who he truly was. But as Hale reached for the door, he froze. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. It wasn't just the papers he needed now. He needed to understand why Lorimer had done all this. What had driven him to go so far? To murder, to manipulate, to deceive on such a grand scale. The answer was closer than Hale realized. Inside the study, Hale flicked on the lamp and scanned the desk. His eyes narrowed as he noticed something out of place. An old photograph tucked beneath a pile of papers. He picked it up, wiping away the dust. It was faded, yellowed with age. In the center of the photograph stood a young Lorimer, a boy barely in his teens, his expression unreadable. Beside him stood a woman Hale recognized instantly, Lady Agatha Vere. His stomach tightened. Lorimer had been more than just a captain. He had been involved with the Vere family for much longer than Hale had ever suspected. But this picture, it suggested something far deeper, far darker. There was a connection here, something personal, something buried beneath the surface. Hale took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He needed to piece this together. The pattern was finally emerging, but it wasn't just about crime, it was about obsession. An obsession that had festered in Lorimer's mind for decades. Lorimer hadn't been chasing money. He hadn't been after power, not in the way Hale had initially thought. Lorimer's motivations had been far more personal. He had been in love with Lady Agatha. That was the key. It had always been the key, Lady Agatha. Despite being the matriarch of the Vere family, had never truly embraced Lorimer. She had seen him as a mere tool, a soldier to be used, discarded when necessary. But for Lorimer, that relationship had become an obsession. The lines between admiration and obsession had blurred long ago. The fire Lorimer had orchestrated. Yes, but it wasn't about silencing Charles Vere, the head of the family. It was about keeping Agatha in his orbit. The fire had been a message, a way to prove his power over her. But it hadn't been enough. She had always been too distant, too cold, too unwilling to acknowledge the hold he had on her. And so, Lorimer had bided his time, manipulating those around him, playing the long game. And now, in Hale, he had found an even bigger challenge, someone who could unravel the truth. But that truth, Hale realized, wasn't about uncovering a simple crime. It was about unmasking Lorimer's madness, his need to control, to have Agatha all to himself. The locket, the hidden clues, the stolen evidence, it had all been about one thing: Lorimer's obsessive need for validation, to prove that he was the one who could control the story, the one who could claim the Vere legacy. Hale's breath caught as the full weight of Lorimer's madness hit him. This wasn't just about a family's fortune, about revenge for a slight or a betrayal. It was about love, twisted into something grotesque, something that could never be realized. Lorimer had fallen into a delusion, believing that if he could just play his cards right, if he could manipulate the people around him, he could finally win Agatha's affection. He could finally make her his. But as Hale stood there in the quiet of the study, the realization settled in. Lorimer had gone to such extremes, not because he was trying to get what he wanted, but because, in his warped mind, he believed that if he destroyed everything, if he caused enough chaos, he could force Agatha to need him, to depend on him, to finally see him as more than just the man who had been cast aside. Lorimer hadn't just manipulated Margaret, or even Charles. He had manipulated everyone, including himself, into believing that his twisted love could fix everything. And now, Hale had the final piece. Lorimer wasn't a criminal driven by greed or vengeance. He was a man driven by an obsessive need to be loved, to be seen, to be needed in a way that he could never be. Hale closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of this revelation settle in his chest. Lorimer wasn't a mastermind of a grand scheme. He was a broken man, incapable of seeing the destruction he had caused. Every lie, every manipulation, every step he had taken, it was all in the name of love. A love that had long since turned into madness. But Hale wasn't done. Not yet. There was still one more thing to do. One last confrontation that would finally put an end to the nightmare. The rain had turned into a relentless downpour, the sound of it hammering against the windows of the manor, like the beat of a war drum. Hale sat at the desk in the study, staring at the papers scattered before him. Everything had led to this moment, every twisted lie, every hidden clue, every false lead. He had walked into Lorimer's web and come out the other side, battered and bruised, but finally, armed with the truth. He was done playing games. It was time to end this. Hale knew what he had to do, but the stakes had never been higher. Lorimer was dangerous, more dangerous than Hale had initially realized. The captain's obsession had made him reckless, but it had also made him unpredictable. There was no telling how Lorimer would react when faced with the consequences of his actions. But Hale was ready. He had one advantage now: the truth. Manor was eerily quiet, save for the storm raging outside. Hale had already sent word to Margaret that he needed her in the drawing room. She had been on edge ever since the attack on Lorimer, unsure of whom to trust. Hale had promised her that he would put an end to the madness. Now, it was time to deliver. He glanced at the clock just after midnight. The final pieces of the puzzle were in place. He knew that Lorimer would try to flee once he realized that Hale had figured everything out. The man had always been calculating, always thinking 3 steps ahead. But Hale had one final trick up his sleeve. It was time to confront Lorimer, to bring the trap to its climax, and Hale knew just how to bait it. Hale met Margaret in the drawing room, where the warm glow of the fire provided a stark contrast to the storm outside. She looked anxious, her hands wringing together in front of her. She had never been fully comfortable in Hale's presence, but there was a quiet understanding between them now, an unspoken agreement that the investigation had to reach its conclusion. "Inspector," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly, "is it really over? Will it finally end?" Hale met her gaze, his eyes hard with determination. "Yes, I promise you. Margaret, it will end tonight. All of this, everything is about to come to light." He could see the doubt in her eyes, the fear. She didn't understand yet, but she would. Hale could feel the walls closing in on him as he set the final pieces of his plan into motion. It wasn't just about exposing Lorimer. It was about ending the torment he had caused and stopping the madness before it consumed anyone else. The storm had grown fiercer, and the wind howled outside the manor's windows. Hale paced the room, his mind sharp as a blade. Lorimer was out there, somewhere, no doubt watching, waiting for his moment. The trap had been set, and it was time to spring it. Hale had made sure to leave just enough of a trail for Lorimer to follow, a small misdirection, a clue placed deliberately where it could be found. It was a risk, but one that he had calculated carefully. He needed Lorimer to think he was still in control. Hale needed him to believe that there was a way out, a way to escape. But there was no escape. Not this time. The door to the drawing room opened with a creak, and Hale's body tensed. He didn't need to turn around to know who had entered. Lorimer. The man stood there, framed in the doorway, drenched from the rain, his face half hidden by the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. He looked as composed as ever, his eyes cold and calculating. He had come for the final confrontation, just as Hale had known he would. But the moment he stepped into the room, Lorimer's eyes flicked to Margaret, his expression hardening. Hale was ready. "Inspector," Lorimer said, his voice dripping with disdain, "I thought you might be waiting for me. It seems you've figured it out. Well, congratulations. But do you really think you can stop me?" Hale didn't flinch. He kept his gaze steady, never breaking eye contact with Lorimer. "I don't need to stop you. Lorimer, you've already done the work for me," Lorimer sneered, his lips curling. "You've played your part, Hale, but you're too late. The game was never about you. It was about her." He glanced at Margaret, his eyes narrowing. "You still don't get it, do you? All of this, it was always about me and Agatha. Everything I've done, every step I've taken, it was for her." The madness was clear in Lorimer's eyes now. He wasn't just a villain. He was a man consumed by obsession, by an irrational belief that he could control the world around him. Hale knew it then. The entire investigation had never been about money, revenge, or power. It had been about one thing, one twisted obsession: Lorimer's desire for Agatha. The murder, the manipulations, the lies, it had all been for her, to force her into his life, to make her need him in a way that no one else could. Lorimer stepped forward, his movements deliberate, like a predator closing in on its prey. "You've played your part in my little game, Inspector. You've uncovered the clues. You've chased the lies. But in the end, it was always about me and her, and you can't stop me now." Hale's pulse quickened. He knew the trap was working. Lorimer's ego was too big to ignore, too self-assured to see it coming. The pieces were falling into place, and Hale was about to make the final move. "You're wrong," Hale said softly, his voice a quiet counterpoint to the storm raging outside. "You've made one critical mistake, Lorimer." Lorimer's eyes flashed. "What mistake?" Hale's lips curled into a slight, almost imperceptible smile. "You've underestimated me." In one swift movement, Hale pulled out the letter, the one that had been hidden in plain sight, the one Lorimer had thought he'd destroyed. The letter that tied everything together: Lorimer's obsession with Agatha, the lies, the stolen evidence, the fire. It had all been in the letter, signed with Lorimer's own hand, a confession of sorts. Though it had been cleverly disguised, Lorimer's face drained of color as he recognized the letter. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking. You shouldn't have," but it was too late. Hale stepped forward, his gaze unflinching. "You had your chance, Lorimer, and now you'll face the consequences." With a final, desperate look at Margaret, Lorimer turned and bolted toward the door, but he was too slow. The trap had already been sprung. As Lorimer reached the threshold, the sound of sirens rang out in the distance, their wail echoing through the manor. It was over. Lorimer froze, his face contorted with rage and fear. He turned back to Hale, his eyes wild, but there was no escape. The truth had caught up with him. "Take him," Hale said coldly, his voice steady. The officers rushed in, and Lorimer's fate was sealed. His delusions, his obsessions, they had all led him to this moment. The truth had come to light, and there was no more room for lies. As they dragged him away, Hale turned to Margaret, his expression softening. "It's over," he said quietly, his voice tinged with the relief of knowing the nightmare had finally ended. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she nodded, her hands trembling. "Thank you," she whispered. And for the first time in days, Hale allowed himself to relax, knowing that justice had finally been served. The manor, still alive with the sounds of the storm, now seemed eerily quiet. Hale leaned against the desk in the drawing room, watching as the last of the officers escorted Lorimer out. The room, once thick with tension, had now settled into an unsettling calm. Margaret, standing near the fireplace, still hadn't moved. The shock of the evening seemed to have drained all the color from her face, and for a moment, Hale almost allowed himself to feel the satisfaction of a job well done. But something tugged at the edges of his mind, something he couldn't shake. The case had been wrapped up too neatly. Lorimer had confessed, the evidence was irrefutable, and the storm had begun to ease. Yet Hale couldn't help but feel like there was something left undone. There was a hollow space where answers should have been. The finality of it all seemed almost perfect. His instincts had never failed him before. He straightened up, his gaze flickering to the clock again. It had only been a few hours since Lorimer's capture, yet it felt like a lifetime. Margaret seemed lost in her thoughts, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if trying to hold everything together. He could tell she was relieved, but there was something more, a lingering question in her eyes that hadn't been addressed. "Inspector?" Margaret's voice was soft, hesitant. Do you think Lorimer was alone in all of this?" Hale turned slowly, his eyes meeting hers. He didn't answer immediately. The question hung in the air like a challenge. He had wondered that himself, of course. He had seen the depths of Lorimer's obsession, his twisted love for Agatha. But there was something nagging at Hale, a persistent thought that refused to go away. "No," Hale said finally, his voice low. "Lorimer may have orchestrated the madness, but there's more to this than just him." Margaret looked confused. "But you have the letter." "He confessed." "You." Hale raised a hand to stop her. "He confessed to what he thought was his role. But there's more beneath the surface. There always is." He walked over to the desk, staring down at the scattered papers. They were the same ones that had started it all, the ones he had pored over for days. Yet now, they seemed foreign, as if they no longer held the answers he thought they did. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Hale turned, his mind still racing. "Inspector Hale." A voice called from the hallway. It was one of the officers. "You need to see this." Hale's pulse quickened as he stepped toward the door, his hand on the doorknob. He wasn't sure why, but a sudden unease washed over him. Something was wrong. When he stepped into the hallway, the officer was standing near the stairs, holding a piece of paper in his hand. His face was pale, his hands shaking. "What is it?" Hale asked, his voice sharp with growing concern. The officer hesitated, glancing down at the paper as though he wasn't sure whether to deliver bad news. "It's this, sir," he said, handing it to Hale. Hale's eyes scanned the paper as he took it, his breath catching in his throat. It was another letter, not one Lorimer had written, not one that was meant for him. The letter was addressed to Margaret. Margaret, I'll see you soon. This is far from over. You know what I want. You know what I need. Don't make me wait. Hale's stomach twisted. His mind raced back to everything that had transpired, every single detail he had meticulously pieced together. All of a sudden, nothing felt certain anymore. He turned to Margaret, who stood frozen in place, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You don't understand," Margaret whispered, the words coming out barely above a breath. I thought it was over. I thought I was free of it all. But this changes everything." Hale's mind was working fast, reassembling the puzzle pieces that had felt so complete just moments ago. This letter was proof that Lorimer wasn't the only one involved. But more than that, it was a message, a threat, and the tone was familiar, like a piece of a puzzle Hale hadn't even realized he'd been missing. A flash of memory struck him like a bolt of lightning. The conversation he'd overheard earlier that night, in the midst of the chaos. The odd exchange between Margaret and Lorimer, how she had seemed so calm, almost too calm. The pieces began to fall into place, but the picture they revealed was far from what Hale had expected. "Margaret," Hale said slowly, his voice steady, but his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "How long have you been involved in this?" Her face drained of color, and for the first time, Hale saw the truth. In her eyes, the shock and the fear, those had all been acts. The facade was cracking. "I never wanted this to happen," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling now. "But I was in too deep. Lorimer promised me things. I thought he could fix it. I thought he could make things right. But I was wrong." Hale took a step forward, his voice hard. "Make things right. Margaret, you've been helping him all along, haven't you?" Margaret's eyes flickered away, a brief flash of guilt crossing her features. But it was enough. Hale knew. The truth was clear now. "You were never just the victim, were you?" Hale said. "You've been the one pulling the strings from the start. You knew exactly what Lorimer was doing, and you allowed it. You manipulated him just as much as he manipulated you. The fire, the murder, the lies, it was all part of your plan." Margaret's lips trembled as she took a step back. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt. I only wanted what was mine, what he promised me." Hale clenched his fists. The truth was even darker than he had imagined. It wasn't just Lorimer's obsession with Agatha that had driven him, it was Margaret's own twisted ambition, a thirst for power that had led her down a path of deceit, manipulation, and murder. "You were trying to take the Vere legacy for yourself," Hale said. "You thought you could control it all by using Lorimer. You made him believe you loved him, that you needed him, and in the end, you used him to get what you wanted. All of this, everything was for you." Margaret's face crumpled, the mask slipping entirely. "I thought I could control him. I thought he'd help me get it all. But then it spiraled. I couldn't stop it. I never wanted it to go this far." Hale stepped back, his mind whirling. It wasn't just a crime of passion or obsession. This had been a carefully orchestrated scheme from the very beginning, one that had manipulated Lorimer, the Vere family, and even Hale himself. He could hardly believe it. All this time, he'd been hunting a shadow, chasing a man who had been a mere pawn in someone else's game. And now, just when he thought the case was resolved, Hale realized that the real mastermind had been standing right in front of him all along. Margaret's words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of a truth far darker than Hale had ever anticipated. The storm outside had slowed to a drizzle, but inside the manor, the atmosphere felt as suffocating as ever. Margaret stood there, her facade shattered, her eyes brimming with a mixture of defiance and regret. She was no longer the innocent woman she had presented herself to be. Now she was the true architect of everything that had transpired. Hale took a slow, deliberate breath, trying to steady his racing thoughts. He had suspected her involvement, but to this extent to be the mastermind behind everything had caught him off guard. And yet, as the pieces slid into place, he realized that the signs had been there all along, just beneath the surface. It was the small things, the subtle clues, the quiet moments that he had missed in his haste to solve the case. Margaret's every word had been calculated, her every move deliberate. Even her supposed helplessness had been a manipulation. "You used Lorimer," Hale said quietly, his voice firm, almost pitying. "You fed him your lies, made him believe you needed him, and then you turned him into a puppet for your own gain. You wanted the Vere legacy. You wanted everything: power, wealth, control. And when Lorimer didn't fit into your plan anymore, you let him fall." Margaret's lip trembled, and for a fleeting moment, Hale saw the crack in her armor. She wasn't as confident as she had been, and that made her dangerous. "You don't understand," she whispered. "It wasn't just about money. It wasn't about the Vere name. It was about control, about being free. Finally, from everything, everyone." Hale took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "But you didn't stop, did you? You kept the lies going, manipulated everyone around you, and when it got too dangerous, you had to make sure no one would ever uncover the truth." She shook her head, her hands trembling as she clutched at her chest. "I didn't want anyone to die. I never wanted it to go this far. Lorimer, he was never supposed to kill anyone. You set the stage, Margaret," Hale said, his voice hardening. "You made it all happen. The fire, the thefts, the murders, it all came from you. You played everyone for fools, even me." The quiet in the room was suffocating now, the silence broken only by the distant rumble of thunder. Margaret's gaze dropped to the floor, and Hale could see the weight of her guilt pressing down on her. But guilt was a poor excuse for the destruction she had wrought. "You should have stopped when you had the chance," Hale said. "But you couldn't. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough." Margaret lifted her head, her eyes cold and calculating once again. "And now what? You think you can just expose me? Think you've won?" Hale paused. The words had already left her mouth, but he could see the truth written across her face. She was playing her final card now, her last-ditch attempt to regain control. Margaret had never been helpless. She had never been the innocent bystander. "You don't have much time," Hale said, his voice unflinching. "The police are already on their way. This ends tonight." For a moment, Margaret's lips curled into something that was almost a smile, except it didn't reach her eyes. It was the kind of smile someone wore when they knew the end was near, but they still thought they could change the outcome. "Do you really think it's that easy?" she asked, her voice a low, venomous hiss. "You're missing something. Something that's been under your nose this whole time." Hale's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about? You've been so focused on me," she said, stepping forward, her eyes gleaming with something far more dangerous now. "On Lorimer. You think you've uncovered everything, but there's still a piece you've missed, a final clue, one that you can't ignore." Hale's mind raced, trying to piece together what she meant. Had he missed something? A small detail, something that would change everything again? Margaret laughed softly, the sound more chilling than the storm outside. "You think you've caught me, Inspector, but the real game is just beginning. You have no idea what's still out there." Before Hale could react, Margaret turned sharply, her hands slipping into the folds of her dress. She moved with a speed that shocked him, and in that moment, it was as though time itself had slowed. His instincts kicked in, but it was too late. She had already pulled something from her pocket, a small vial, no larger than a matchstick. Hale lunged forward, but Margaret was faster. She tilted the vial, and in the next instant, a puff of smoke erupted, filling the room with a thick, acrid haze. Hale staggered back, coughing, trying to clear his lungs. The smoke was thick, disorienting, blinding. For a moment, he lost track of her. When the smoke cleared, Margaret was gone. His heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the room frantically, his mind racing. There was no time to waste. He had to stop her. He had to finish this now. Hale dashed for the door, his pulse quickening as he called for backup. The officers had to be close, but Margaret had managed to slip away. She had anticipated his every move, as she always had. The trap had been set perfectly, only she had been the one to escape. Where did she go? Hale muttered to himself, his eyes darting over the empty hallway. It was impossible. There was no way she could have disappeared so quickly. She had been right there, in front of him. His mind flashed back to all the moments he had missed, the moments when Margaret had acted out of place, when she had known just a little too much. She had been orchestrating everything, playing him like a puppet all along. And now, in the final moments of the case, she had vanished into the night, leaving Hale with nothing but the cold realization that justice might never be served. The days that followed were a blur. Hale had been left with the knowledge that Margaret was out there, still pulling strings, still controlling the narrative, despite his best efforts. The case had slipped through his fingers. He had been one step ahead, only to find himself blindsided in the end. The police searched for her. They scoured every corner of the manor, but Margaret had disappeared without a trace, leaving no evidence of where she had gone or how she had managed to vanish. The officers were left with nothing but a cold trail, and Hale was left with the uneasy feeling that, in the end, the true mastermind might never be found. The investigation, it seemed, was far from over. Chat said the rain had long since stopped, but the chill in the air lingered as Hale stepped outside the manor. The night was still, almost unnervingly so. The only sound was the soft crunch of gravel under his boots as he made his way toward the waiting car. He had done everything he could. Every thread had been pulled, every lead exhausted. Yet Margaret's disappearance hung over him like a cloud, dark and foreboding. There was something unfinished about it all, something that refused to let him move on. He slid into the back seat of the car, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. The driver didn't speak, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Hale's mind wasn't on the path in front of them, though. He was replaying the events of the past few days over and over in his mind, searching for something, anything that might have slipped through the cracks. He had caught Margaret in her lie. He had exposed her for the mastermind she was, but she had vanished without a trace, leaving Hale with a sense of profound unease. The case was solved, in a way. Lorimer was locked away, and the evidence was irrefutable. But Hale couldn't shake the feeling that the true resolution had been just out of reach. His eyes flickered to the window, watching as the lights of the manor faded into the distance. He had done his duty, but the feeling of completion, of closure, was elusive. It wasn't just the escape of the villain that gnawed at him. It was the details, the small, subtle things that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now stood out in sharp relief. He hadn't been able to place them before, but now they were impossible to ignore. His mind drifted back to the cryptic words Margaret had left him with. "You're missing something, Inspector, something that's been under your nose this whole time." Hale's eyes narrowed. He had thought it was just another of her manipulations, another attempt to get under his skin. But what if she hadn't been lying? What if there was something more, something hidden in plain sight? The car turned a corner, and Hale's gaze shifted to the small piece of paper he had taken from the manor before leaving. The letter, Margaret's final warning. He had almost discarded it, thinking it was just another taunt. But now, as the words swirled in his mind, they seemed different. There was something in the phrasing, something about the way she had written it that felt off. He pulled the paper from his coat pocket and read it again. The familiar words standing starkly against the dim light in the car. "Margaret, I'll see you soon. This is far from over. You know what I want. You know what I need. Don't make me wait." At first glance, it seemed like a straightforward threat, but Hale had learned long ago that the most important details were the ones that seemed the most obvious. He reread the lines, and then it hit him, the second part of the message. Don't make me wait. Wait. Why had she chosen those words? What was it that she was waiting for? A thought flashed through Hale's mind, and for a moment, the car seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing in as the realization began to settle. He couldn't shake it. There was something more to the timing, something about Margaret's escape that suggested she was preparing for something bigger. Hale set the letter down on the seat beside him, his fingers tapping the edge of the paper as he stared out the window. He was so close, too close to walk away now. "Drive to the station," Hale said suddenly, his voice sharp with determination. The driver didn't question him, simply nodding in acknowledgement as he made a sharp turn onto the main road, heading toward the city. Hale's thoughts raced. The case wasn't over, not by a long shot. Margaret hadn't just escaped the manor, she had left behind a breadcrumb trail, a series of messages meant for someone else. But who? The station was empty when Hale arrived, save for a few officers finishing up paperwork. The building smelled of stale coffee and dry paper. The the low hum of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Hale's shoes clicked sharply against the floor as he made his way toward his office. The familiar weight of the case files sat heavy on his shoulders. But there was still one more thing he needed to do. He flipped through the file of the case once more, pulling out the photographs and notes that had piled up during the investigation. As he sifted through them, one photograph caught his eye, a close-up of a small trinket found at the scene of one of the murders. It had seemed insignificant at the time, nothing more than a small, inconspicuous item. But now, in the wake of everything that had transpired, it felt different. The trinket, a simple silver locket, was marked with the name E.M. Hale's pulse quickened. E.M. The initials burned into his mind like a branding iron. They didn't mean anything at first, but now they seemed to stand for something crucial, something Margaret had kept hidden. E.M. He ran the initials through his mind, his heart racing as the realization hit him like a sudden storm. E.M. was not just a person, it was a clue, a connection, a name, perhaps, or a person from the past who had been tied to Margaret's twisted scheme. Hale had been so focused on the present, on Lorimer and Margaret, that he had missed the trail leading back to someone else. He grabbed his coat and headed for the door, the file still clutched tightly in his hands. This was it. He wasn't going to let this case slip away, not when he was so close. He needed to find out who E.M. was and why Margaret had kept their name hidden from everyone. Hale walked into the street, the cool night air biting at his skin. He hailed a passing taxi, giving the driver a name that was only just beginning to form in his mind. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together, but there was still so much left unanswered. As the taxi pulled away, Hale gazed out the window, watching the city fade behind him. The investigation had never been about the answers, it had always been about the questions. And now, the questions were piling up faster than he could answer them. The road ahead was uncertain, and as the car drove into the unknown, Hale knew this would not be his last case. There was always more, always another mystery to solve. Margaret's cryptic message was just the beginning, and for Hale, the pursuit of truth would never end.